let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we ask you to send down your Holy Spirit upon us and help us to better understand what it is that you've revealed to us in your divine Son, Jesus Christ. We ask that we might grow in faith, hope, and love, and better increase our desire to serve you in all ways. And on this day, which is dedicated to Our Lady, we'll ask for her intercession as we pray together. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father Zig asked me a couple of weeks ago, what we kind of planned on presenting today, and I gave him a working title, From Purple Elephants to the Son of God, and I think he was very nervous about that title. And it is a little bit ridiculous in some ways, but hopefully it'll make sense. I'd like to kind of maybe start with a very simple, ridiculous question for you. What is this? Again, simple, ridiculous, hopefully not too condescending question. It's a pen, right? I was kind of waiting for someone to say, like, it's a projection of light from the distilling pixelation. All right, it's a pen. Fantastic. All right, we can all agree that this is a pen. I'm going to disagree with all of you, and I'm going to make a ridiculous point, and I'm going to say that this isn't a pen, but this is a purple elephant. Am I correct? Sure? How many say sure? How many say you're insane, you're blind, or you're being ridiculous, whatever, right? We all disagree that this is a pen, right? So for me to stand up here and say, no, it's not a pen, it's in fact a purple elephant, shows me that probably you're thinking that I'm ridiculous, or insane, or blind, right? Hopefully, hopefully. Here's the point I'm getting at. Things are what they are, regardless of our individual, or in this case, my particular assignment to it. Whatever I particularly say about this item that's on the screen right there, I can call it a purple elephant, I can call it a whatever I want. It doesn't change the reality of what it is. It is what it is in itself. It is a pen. So I can call it a purple elephant, and that sounds whatever. It doesn't change what it is. It is a pen, right? We can all collectively agree on that. Very simple point. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm going to move hopefully closer to the Son of God. But let's move very slowly here. In philosophy, there's a basic principle, the principle of non-contradiction, basically stating that two things can't both be and not be at the same time in the same way, right? So that can't be both a pen and a purple elephant at the same time in the same way. They are logically contradictory to each other. So these are things that are contradictory statements, cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. Two propositions, A is B and A is not B, are mutually exclusive. Therefore, they cannot be both true at the same time. You can't have a squared circle. You can say the words, there exists a squared circle, but is it a true statement? No, of course not, right? You can even try your best to think about a squared circle, but is it even possible? If you were to close your mind right now and say, imagine a circle, and now imagine a square circle. Can you do it? No, of course not. It's a logical contradiction. It violates the principle of non-contradiction. The very nature of circleness and the very nature of squareness are mutually exclusive. They're contrary statements, so they both can't be true at the same time in the same way. Now this works for squared circles, this works for A is B, A is not B. It works for us in our practical lives. I am here right now in Rockaway, New Jersey on October the 27th at about just about almost 9 o'clock. I can't also be in the Philippines on the beach, you know, sipping a margarita at the same time in the same way. Hopefully I can go next week. I'm not, I hope. But I can't be at the same time in the same way. These are logically contradictory statements. So the principle of non-contradiction is a very basic, like philosophy 101 point. And again, I don't mean to be condescending, but I think these are important realities for us to talk about, to establish what we're going to get into that hopefully has a little bit more meat on it. Now, part of our culture, part of our society would reject a lot of this. And it's not just a kind of whimsical, like vague generalization of our society or culture where everyone is very relativistic and your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. But these are real things that we have to wrestle with. The Supreme Court made this statement in 1992, which is very troubling. Justice Kennedy said, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, of the mystery of human life." That's a huge statement by the Supreme Court. All right, in their official ruling on a case, Casey versus Planned Parenthood. Now, the case doesn't particularly matter, but it points out something that exists that we can kind of get the feel for in our personal relationships. Right? We all have family members, friends, co-workers, people we've interacted with who might say something like, "Well, that's true for you, but that's not true for me," or "That's what you believe, but this is what I believe," and everyone just wants to get along and be happy and hold hands and whatever. And that sounds great. You know, those are great punchline, not punchlines, but kind of tagline slogans for campaigns and things like that. But they violate the principle of non-contradiction in some sense, right? We have to make sure that things that are logically opposed to each other both can't be true at the same time and in the same way. Now, one of the things I think is very uncomfortable for us, and I know I've experienced it myself with both my family relationships. My brother in particular is non-religious, non-practicing of anything, and so we've had over the years a number of times we've kind of collided and bumped heads over different topics of faith, the existence of God, the authority of the church, all kinds of different things. And they're awkward and they're uncomfortable, and you probably have had similar exchanges, I'm sure, over the years with friends, co-workers, family members, and they're very difficult. And the feeling that we oftentimes get is that we don't want to kind of upset the apple cart. The kind of most sacred, hallowed ground in our culture right now is the not truth, but tolerance, right? This idea of tolerance. We have to tolerate what other people think and believe and just kind of all get along. And that sounds nice, but at its very core is a logical contradiction. And here's what I mean. Pope Benedict, before he became Pope Benedict, as Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, in the 1990s wrote a book called Truth and Tolerance, where he investigated the question, is the Catholic Church, at its very core, intolerant? And he kind of goes through all kinds of different philosophical and theological arguments either way. And he ultimately comes to the conclusion that yes, the Catholic Church at its very core is intolerant. And it's intolerant of things that are opposed truth. Because we make truth claims as Catholics. We make claims that God exists. We make claims that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and so on and so forth. And so what his conclusion was is very uncomfortable for us to say out loud sometimes, because I think we misunderstand the idea of tolerance, or we don't like conflict, which is understandable. None of us like conflict. But it's a really important reality for us to understand as we move forward, which is this. To be a Catholic, to be a follower of Jesus Christ, to be a believer in God, means that we are going to be inherently intolerant of people who oppose that idea of truth, because we're making a truth claim. And if we are and by intolerant, I don't mean being rude, that's not what I'm saying. I don't mean being abrasive or being pushy on people and being offensive to people. That's not what I mean by intolerant. But what I mean is that we're not going to make claims and statements to say, well, it's perfectly fine if you think that's true, or if you think that's true, or if you think this is true. They're all perfectly fine, right? You probably heard people say things like, it doesn't matter what you practice or what you believe. We're all kind of like on this mountain making our way up to God. It doesn't matter what path you follow, whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or non-religious, right? What's the big thing in our culture now? People saying, I'm not religious, I'm just spiritual, right? What does that mean? I'm spiritual, but not religious. Have you ever had anyone say that? Probably. You've heard that before, right? I've heard that tons of time, right? I don't believe in organized religion. I just kind of follow a spiritualism. What the heck does that mean, right? You ever encounter someone who says that? Ask them to kind of define, what does that mean? What is it that you actually believe in? What is it that you hold to? This kind of vague notion of spiritual realities, but without having a firm concept of what is actually true or false, what is logically contradictory to itself. And these are real things, and they're uncomfortable things, and I think they're things that we as parents can understand as important. Now, you know, think back when your kids were little, maybe you still have really young kids. I've got a 1-year-old at home who's walking around and getting his hands on everything. And he always wants to eat everything because he's 1. He doesn't know anything. So he sees, because my older kids have, they're into Legos now, so they got Legos that they leave everywhere because they're slobs. And they just drive me crazy. So they leave their Legos everywhere, and then my 1-year-old walks by and he's like, fantastic, look, a Lego. That looks delicious. So he goes to pick up his Lego and he goes to put it into his mouth. And me as a good parent says, well, I'm going to be tolerant of your belief system and what you wish to do and what you truly believe is food. Go ahead and eat the Lego, son. No, of course not. That's ridiculous, right? We would never allow that. We would slap it out of their hands, pull it out of their mouth, tell them no, yell at the older kids to clean up the mess, whatever it is, because we can recognize what is true, right, and what is good in the situation, right? And what is true is don't eat Legos when you're 1 year old. It's just not good for you, okay? Now, again, that's a very simple thing, but as we kind of move forward and become more complex and more sophisticated, as our children get older, as we get older, we interact with other adults, we have to kind of keep in mind that that same basic principle still applies. And again, it's not easy. I see many times for parents with older kids in the middle school range and moving into the high school range, difficulties with continuing the faith with their children and kind of continuing to pass on the faith. A number of times I've talked with parents on the phone who've said things like, well, my husband and I, my wife and I, we're going to continue to go to church about the faith of the church, right? That God exists, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, He's established, whatever. If we believe that those are true things, it's a really strange thing to say, yeah, that's important. Those are real things. That I hope to go to heaven one day by holding fast to these truths. But I'm okay with you going to hell by picking your own route. Like, that's a very strange thing, but we hear it over and over and over and over again because it creates a certain conflict, and we're anxious about conflict, and I get that. And sometimes I think what happens, and a number of people have told me this over the years, is that part of the reason why they're afraid of conflict is because they don't feel as equipped to be able to discuss these things as fully as maybe they should. And so there's a bit of a struggle here. Let me just kind of break for a second. My wife, she bugs me. This is being recorded, by the way. She bugs me. She drives me nuts sometimes. She annoys me. Just for the record, I also do that to her like twice as much easily, if not a lot more. We annoy the heck out of each other at times. Not always, of course, but we certainly bug each other. And everyone who's ever been in a relationship knows that this happens. It's part of the marriage process in some ways, right? You drive each other crazy to the point where you get into arguments and yell about stuff, and then you become so insistent about just, all right, I'm going off on a tangent. But we get into difficult times. And what happens when I get into an argument with my wife is I typically decide that I'm going to run away with a mistress for a long weekend. No, that's not true at all. I don't ever do that. She catches wind of that. That's false. I'm just making a bad example, right? Of course we don't do that. So why don't I do that? Or why doesn't she do that, right? Because, well, we love each other. Well, that's fantastic. Here's the point I'm driving at. Marriage and relationships are really easy when everything's like sunshine and rainbows and happy days and holding hands, right? I love my wife. She's beautiful. It's wonderful. Like, everything's happy. But when things start to get tense, why do we stick around? Well, because both of our names are on the mortgage, of course. Like, sometimes it can feel like that. But here's what we have to do. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves of the reasons why we love each other, right? So I'll have to sometimes think with my intellect more than my emotions, if you will. Why do I stay with my wife? Why do I still love her? Why is she important? And it might be an intellectual reminder because my kids will remind me to knock it off and stop ignoring mommy, whatever. I don't mean to give you the impression we always fight. That's really not the case, but I think we all get it, right? So, but I have to remind myself intellectually, why do I love her, right? And then I might go through the list of, well, when we met, she was this, and then she's always been this. We've done this together, and we've been through these together. And we made a commitment together, and I see her good qualities here, and I see how she makes up for what I'm lacking here. Oh my gosh, I'm such a bonehead. I do dumb things all the time. So there becomes a reflection of the intellectual reasons of why we are together that help then rekindle and stir the emotions, if you will, that kind of bring the marriage back together and forgiveness and such and blah, 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 blah. Right? So we all get this, okay? Now, what does this have to do with the faith? The church thinks in a very similar way. See, there's a problem that exists among a lot of believers, which is the idea that we have to be overly rational, right? That we are rationalists. That everything has to fall into perfect logical order and be perfectly explainable by the sciences and so on and so forth. That's an incomplete view of our faith, right? On the flip side of it, there's those who might recall fideists, right? Those who simply hold on to a blind sense of faith. Well, the church teaches it, my mom taught it, my grandma taught it, I've always believed it, it's what I do, it's what I grew up with, so that's what I do. Well, why do you do it? I don't know, it's just what I do, right? That's also inadequate. The church proposes a twofold approach to authentically living out the faith of Jesus Christ, right? And if any of you have ever gotten an email from me, which is probably everyone in this room, probably too many emails at times, right? You've gotten an email, if you ever looked at the bottom of my email, my tagline that I always have is this quote right here from Pope St. John Paul II in his encyclical letter Fides et Ratio, which was written in the mid-1990s, I believe. It's on faith and reason, and this is from the very beginning of it. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth. In a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. What are we getting at here? Our approach to God needs to be one that is both faithful, right? Believing what we do not see, what cannot be explained by the natural sciences, let's say, and at the same time needs to be grounded in rational explanations of the universe, right? So we don't oppose science, we don't oppose thinking, we don't oppose any kind of sound philosophical use of our capabilities as human beings, but we're using both faculties together, and when we use both of those faculties together, both faith and reason, we're able to soar, which is, I think, great, beautiful imagery, like two wings, in which the human spirit soars in contemplation of the truth, right? That desire for truth. Everyone in this room wants truth. None of you want to be lied to. In fact, it's one of those great offenses that we take very personally when we get lied to, whether it's by our children when they lie about, did you clean your room? Or it's by our spouse, or by even the neighbors, or whoever. Whenever we discover that we've been lied to about something, we feel a great injustice. Why do we feel a great injustice? Because we're made for truth. We're made to live in the truth. And so when we experience a lie or something that goes against the truth, we feel a great sense of injustice because it's true. We're not made for lies. We all desire and seek after the truth. Part of the problem is that I think when we experience lesser truths, right, small little grains and glimpses of the truth, we sometimes settle in and we get comfortable, right? And I'd make the comparison to, like, if you were to think back on maybe your relationship with your spouse when you first met, and you kind of think like how wonderful it was. And you reflect on it maybe like, okay, it's been 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, whatever, however many years later. And you think about like how much more sophisticated your relationship has become with your spouse. As much as it was nice at the beginning, sometimes you might want to go back there for the simplicity of it, you realize there's so much more depth now. And why is there more depth? Because you understand each other better, right? You see the other person with a certain amount of clarity and truthfulness, even though they have all these disgusting habits that you notice about where they do with their socks and how they don't put the towels away and how whatever. Pick your annoying habit that they have, but you also notice the depths of their ability to love and their ability to do good things. And so there's a great simplicity in this idea of we're made for the truth, and when we want the truth, what we should desire is a more fullness of the truth, right? Does that make sense? I think that, right? I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, again, throw any loose items you have at me. I'm welcome to your thoughts and your feedback on this. All right, so here's the basics. We got things exist, and they exist not because of my personal opinion of them, right? So we've got a pen, it's a pen, doesn't matter what I call it, it's still a pen, right? We've got the principle of non-contradiction, the two things can't be and not be at the same time in the same way. All right, let's ask the big question. Does God exist? I'm assuming because you're here, you'd say yes. Fair, right? Fantastic. If I asked you to give a response, and I was going to do something, but I thought maybe it would take too much time, it would be somewhat offensive. You know, YouTube is fantastic, but it's also filled with so much garbage. And if you ever search for religious things on YouTube, you're bound to come across a lot of atheistic videos. And what is atheism? Atheism is the rejection of a belief in God, right? It makes a truth claim of its own, saying there is no God, right? Agnosticism would say, I'm not sure if there's a God, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, I'll kind of withhold judgment. But atheism makes a truth claim saying there is no God. And there's lots of people who make claims for atheism that go back centuries. It's not a new phenomenon, but it's certainly one that's becoming very loud and very vocal today in our world. And there's lots of arguments that they propose. And again, I was going to show a short video on it, but I thought maybe it would be a bit distracting. But I will kind of highlight something. So instead of me trying to be creative and come up with my own arguments and stuff, I'm going to go to one of the best, one of the great saints of all time, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican priest who lived in the 13th century. And in the 13th century, he was considered, not just then, but also now, one of the smartest people the church has ever seen and ever produced, one of the greatest saints we've ever seen. He wrote his great masterpiece, his Summa Theologiae, which is just a summary of theology. This book right here is kind of a short excerpts of it. So the full summary, his full Summa is about yay big if we were to have it printed out here with us, so it's huge. St. Thomas Aquinas calls it his Intro to Theology for Beginners. So yeah, this is kind of shows the depth of the things that he's written. He wrote so much in telling stories about St. Thomas Aquinas. At the end of his life, he had a mystical vision of some sort, a vision of God or of heaven, something fantastic. We're not exactly sure. And when he kind of came out of this moment of ecstasy, his brother priests were around him. They said, you know, what did you see? What happened? What's going on here? And he said, everything I've written is straw. Destroy it. Get rid of it all. Because compared to the glory of God, it's garbage. Right? Now, thankfully, they didn't listen to him, and they kept his writings. And so we're able to draw a lot of wisdom from the things that he wrote. So what I'd like to do is maybe, could I ask a little help maybe? Would you mind passing out? Just so everyone has something maybe to follow along with and take home. The short excerpt. So St. Thomas Aquinas, he structured his Summa in kind of a question and answer format. He's very systematic in his approach to doing theology, meaning he's going to take a very much of a building block approach to things. Within his Summa, he's going to propose a number of questions. He always structures his articles, his questions, in the same way. So he always builds up first his opponent's argument. So if you've ever been into an argument, whether it's a more formal like debate club argument or even just an argument with your spouse or a friend or whatever, we tend to make what's called straw man arguments, meaning that like we say things like for instance, if my wife and I were arguing about something, which never happens, and I were to say, well, you're only saying that because, and then I go ahead and make her argument for her, but I make it really weak, I make it really lame. Like, you're only saying that we have to go visit your parents because, you know, you just feel guilty about it or whatever. Now, she's going to throw something at me for saying that, but I'm making a really weak argument so that then I can knock down her argument and point out why it's not a good argument. Then I become the winner of the... And so the moral atheist denies the existence of God because they don't want to change the way that they live, because if God exists, that means certain things, meaning he's got law, rules, order, right, consequences, all those different things that make us all really nervous. And so they might deny the existence of God for that purpose. And then thirdly and lastly, there would be what we might call the intellectual atheist, someone who makes an argument, in some ways trying to make a rational, intellectual argument against the existence of God. Similar to this problem of evil, problem of suffering, which we've all experienced in our lives. And St. Thomas articulates it in a really interesting way with this idea of two contraries. If one of them is infinite, it would destroy the other completely. He offers a reply to this, very simply put. As St. Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his work unless his omnipotence, which means his powerfulness, and his goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. Now that's not an easy pill to swallow at all. But I'll tell you this. If we were to kind of look and say, what in the history of humankind was the greatest evil that was ever committed? What might you say? Holocaust, okay, that's fair. 9/11, sure. All of those serious injustice, great evils. I propose an even greater evil. Right there. The crucifixion of the God-man. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. If he's truly God, and we killed him, I mean us in this room particularly, But if human beings killed God, murdered God, that's a pretty darn evil thing to do, right? And out of that great evil, what do we believe came from that? What happened 3 days later, right? The resurrection. What does that mean for us practically here today? We have a chance at eternal life and our sins to be forgiven. That's a pretty darn good thing to have happen. So out of this greatest evil that could possibly ever happen, right? The killing of God himself, the Son of God, God uses and allows for that evil to happen so as to bring about an even greater good, which is the forgiveness of all people. It's a pretty fantastic thing. Now think back to your own experiences, my own experiences of evil. I don't understand why different family members I have gotten sick, or why they've experienced injustices, or why they've been victims of abuse, or whatever. I certainly don't understand. I don't make a claim to say that something very simple down the line is going to come out of that. Because oftentimes that good that's going to come out of that might not be realized by any person here and now, right? But in the book of Job, I find it very interesting. If you're familiar in the Old Testament with the book of Job, the character of Job is a very fascinating figure. And if you ever just want like a good read on a rainy Saturday afternoon, the book of Job in the Old Testament, it's a fascinating read. It basically goes like this. It starts out with Job, the righteous, good guy, follower of the law, loves God, all these good things. And Satan has a conversation with God at the beginning of the book, and he says basically, listen, the only reason Job worships and is faithful is because you favor him. You give him all these blessings, and he has wealth, and he's got peacefulness and health and whatever. So God allows for the devil to impose suffering upon Job. So Job begins a really difficult period of trials where he loses family members, he becomes ill, he suffers great tragedy, his property and his wealth is taken away from him. He basically is reduced to a shell of his old self. And throughout the whole process of his suffering, he has friends who are coming up to him and saying things like, you must have done something evil, Job. It's probably because you sinned. He's saying, I didn't sin, I didn't do anything. He's saying, well, it must be because of whatever. Go ahead and curse God, because I'm not going to curse God, right? So throughout the book, you're seeing these like dramas of sufferings and people telling him, just blame God for everything. He says, no, 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 no. Job finally gets to the point where he lashes out at God towards the end of the book, and he says basically like, what did you do this for? Like, what did I ever do to you? Which, again, these are words I've said before in my personal life, and maybe you've said them in your own life. What did I ever do to you, Lord? I show up to church, I do my good deeds and whatever. Why do I have to deal with this? God gives the longest reply in the entire scriptures in his response to Job, where he goes on and on and on. And almost kind of the way that like you might kind of chastise your child when they do something foolish, when they kind of say like, why can't I go to my friend's house? Why can't I do that? And you're just like, leave me alone, stop bugging me. And then finally you lash out and be like, the reason why you can't stay up till midnight eating candy is because, and then you fill in the blank with, your teeth are going to rot, and you're going to be, whatever. You know this. God has a similar response to Job, right? So he responds to him by saying, were you there when I created the heavens and the earth? Were you there? Do you even know about the animals across the world that I've created that you've never seen? Do you have any role in this big plan of the universe that I've set in motion and I've created? And he kind of gives this remarkable context to Job, saying, I know everything that's going on here. I'm aware of all that's happening. I'm the creator of everything. And so I've got a certain plan that I'm executing, even though you don't understand it because you're just this guy here in this little spot in town, in history, whatever. But I've got a plan for everything. And it's a pretty remarkable story. And Job eventually comes back to the Lord, and he's restored in health, and he ends up having even more blessings, and everything kind of comes back, right? So it's an interesting story. It's a good Saturday afternoon read if you're curious. Anyway, the problem of evil, something we deal with. It begs the question, does God exist? And that's what we want to get at. Now think back to when we started this, the principle of non-contradiction, right? Something either is or isn't. So the question is, does God actually exist? Now again, you're here probably because you would say yes. That's good. Thank you for saying yes. The papers that you have, if you're curious, this comes from St. Thomas, and this is kind of just his one article there. St. Thomas is going to give a reply on the affirmative, a positive response to this. His 5 ways, right? So his 5 arguments to demonstrate using reason, right, that God exists. Now, just to be clear, his arguments for the existence of God have nothing to do with the scriptures. He doesn't quote the Bible. He doesn't quote popes who come before him or other saints. He's going to use logical arguments to demonstrate that God exists. However, just so that we're all on the same page, he's not going to say anything about Jesus just yet. Later in the Summa he does. But something that's really important for us to understand, this is kind of getting back to my point where I mentioned about my wife and I fighting, right? Sometimes I have to be reminded of why I love her. Similarly, in our lives, when we think about, why do I even go to church? Why do I bother? We're going to be challenged with suffering and all these different things. Sometimes it's good for us to have a clear, logical, reasonable argument, if you will, to be able to remind ourselves of yes, God does exist. So St. Thomas is going to offer 5. I want to just look at 2 of them, and we'll try to look at them quickly because I want to make sure that we're not staying here all morning. So we'll look at them maybe very quickly. And you can follow along on your paper. This is just some excerpts of it on the screen here, but we'll read along on the paper. The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas the thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus that which is actually hot as fire makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot. What is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, and the staff, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put it in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Simple, right? Simple and straightforward, right? Everyone's good on that? Fantastic, right? That's great. Let's move on. We're all ready for our doctorate in philosophy, right? Okay, let's kind of break this down a little bit. Here's what he's saying. A very simple, plain language. And his other arguments sometimes get a little bit more complex, but we'll keep with this one because I think it's very easily demonstrable. Everything moves. And by moves, he means changes. So everyone in this room is currently changing. We're aging. We're, for some of us, balding. We're going through diving. I don't know, whatever. We're hopefully learning, and our brains are changing and forming more depths of truth. I don't know. We're always in a process of change, right? This water bottle here is actually here in my hands. Is it flying across the room right now? Is it potentially flying across the room right now? Yeah. And we can have some fun with this if I want to chuck it across the room. But I don't because I want my water. But it potentially could fly across the room, right? All of us have within us, we exist in what we call 2 states, actuality and potentiality, meaning that we actually are what we are right now. Sitting here, whatever, doing whatever we're doing. We're potentially also doing other things. So we're potentially maybe driving home, we're potentially having a conversation on the phone, fill in the blank, whatever you want. There's certain limitations to this, of course, like we're not potentially turning into purple elephants. That's not within our nature. But we are in a constant state of of actuality with the possibility of changing to something else. Now, what are we getting at here? Imagine that you are stuck in Dover at the railroad crossings, or here in town at the railroad crossing, and the train's coming, and you're like, oh, I'm on my way to work, I'm stuck here, whatever. And you see cars just coming, and you don't see an end in sight with the train cars coming. Would you reasonably conclude that there's an infinite number of train cars? No, of course not. No rational person would come to that conclusion. What if you just saw them coming for days and weeks and they never seem to stop? Eventually you probably just turn around and go somewhere else, right? Here's what I'm getting at here. St. Thomas Aquinas is saying everything moves. We notice this, we see this, whether it's the water bottle, it's ourselves, it's our intellect, it's our aging, it's person to person, right? We all move, but we all move by something else causing it to move. The water bottle only flies across the room if I chuck it across the room. It doesn't move itself across the room. Even so much for myself, if I were to walk across the room, I'm only able to walk across the room because I was given the active motion by my parents. Thanks, Mom and Dad. You were given this active motion by your parents. And let's keep going backwards and backwards and backwards, move your way through evolution. However distance you want to go, you cannot go on to infinity. If you go on to infinity at a railroad crossing, and if it's going on for what seems like forever, you know that if those train cars would become hitched, right? That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. If they would become unhitched, yeah, they would stop moving. Yes? Makes sense. Why are they stop moving? Because they were only moving because something else was causing them to move. Namely, one engine or whatever at the front of it or at the back of it, whatever, however they, I don't know how trains work. A 7-year-old could probably explain this better than me. But things move insofar as they are put into motion by something else. You can't go back to infinity. You have to have what's called an unmoved mover. And that's what Thomas Aquinas is going to argue. That is what God is. Something that does not get its motion, its change, its activity from something else. He is what we call pure actuality, which is just a technical way of saying he is what he is, pure existence. Now there's a kind of a misunderstanding when people talk about God. People use the terms, he's like the supreme being, right? We use these too sometimes, maybe even mistakenly. God is the supreme being, and that's false. God is not the supreme being. Technically speaking, God is being itself. He's not kind of in this food chain with us, right? Like, all right, I'm a guy, I'm a person, have more life and more being, if you will, than a cat. Right? Because I can become rational, I can build things, I can stand here at a microphone and ramble on for 30 minutes, whatever. The cat has more being than a plant, because the cat can move around. And the plant has more being than a rock, because a rock just sits there doing nothing. Right? So in this hierarchy of being, God's not like the top of the food chain, this supreme being. That's false. Because what's going on in this food chain of being? Right? This little table here exists. Yeah? Fantastic. It's occupying time and space. I want to occupy that time and space right now. So what do I have to do to the table? I've demonstrated conflict with that table, right? It's in my way, I push it out of the way. There's a bug on the floor, it's in my way, I'm going to squash it out of existence, right? When we occupy the same time and space, if you will, of other beings, we are naturally in competition with those other things. So God is not kind of in this hierarchy of being, because if he was, he would be in natural competition with us, meaning occupying the same time and space. And certainly we don't want to be in competition with God, because we become like the bugs that get squashed. God is outside of time and space. Thomas Aquinas would say he's ipsum esse, being itself. Okay, these are all technical terms. Anyway, that's the first argument. We're not going to spend too much time, so we're moving a little bit, taking a little bit much more time than I wanted to. The fifth way, we don't have to worry about this. The arguments are interesting. They're sometimes difficult. If you do want to research this further on your own, later this afternoon after you're done reading the book of Job, I would suggest on YouTube there are, avoid the crazy stuff, but there is some really great content on there. Bishop Robert Barron particularly does a really nice job. If you're interested, and he does short videos, and I think he has a video on each of the different arguments from the existence of God from St. Thomas, and they're really well done. They're only about 10 minutes or so, much shorter than how I'm rambling here. Anyway, that's the fifth way. We're going to skip that one. So here's the question we move to next, right? We're kind of building up on these different steps, right? Do things exist? The principle of non-contradiction. Does God exist? Yes or no? If we were able to argue, and I think St. Thomas Aquinas does a good job of forming an intellectual argument for does God exist, right? And that is opposed to the idea that God does not exist, right? Logical contradictions. God can't exist as being all-powerful, all-good, all-loving, and at the same time not exist. They oppose each other, right? So your atheistic cousin who you see at Thanksgiving, right? When they start saying God doesn't exist, like, for the sake of peace in the family, not throwing, mashed potatoes at each other, yeah, maybe play nice, but at the same time, like, we can't say like, oh yeah, that's true for you, this is true for me. Like, that's false. That's like letting my 1-year-old eat a Lego because that's food for you, son. No, there are logical contradictions. So God exists, so we have to ask the question, who is this God? Let's see. All right. I'm going to turn it over to, I mentioned Bishop Robert Barron. This is only about a 5 or 6 minute long video. We'll see if this
The most important thing to know about Jesus is that he's God. Jesus is the God-man. There's been a tendency in recent years to reduce Jesus to the level of a great teacher or a great prophet or guru. Read much of the Christology of the last 30 or 40 years, and you'll find that. There's a hyper-stress on the humanity of Jesus. Now, Jesus is human. That's quite right. But the most important thing to know about him is that he's also divine. The Gospel of John, we hear, in the beginning was the Word. That same Word, by the way, that has made the whole universe, the Word I spoke of earlier, that grounds the intelligibility of the world, that's behind all the science of the world, that same Word, who is God, became flesh in Jesus Christ. Also in John's Gospel, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And his I am there echoes the I am who I am of Exodus 3:14. When Moses said to God, what's your name? And he says, I am who I am. Jesus echoes that. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the vine. Before Abraham was, I am. Philip says, Lord, show us the Father. And Jesus says, have you been with me this long that you still don't know? The one who sees me sees the Father. In John's Gospel, it's explicitly laid out that Jesus is divine. But the same is true in the other Gospels too. But they use a somewhat different symbol system. So we find, for example, Jesus heals the paralyzed man. And he said, my son, your sins are forgiven. And the bystanders say, well, who is this man? Only God can forgive sin. Which is precisely the point. Mark is telling us there, this Jesus is God. He also says in the Synoptic Gospels, unless you love me more than your mother and father, more than your very life, you're not worthy of me. Well, that's breathtaking. That's an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? You might imagine a religious teacher saying, unless you love my teaching more than your mother and father, unless you love God. I can imagine any prophet or guru or teacher saying that. But Jesus says, unless you love me more than the greatest goods in the world, you're not worthy of me. Who can say that coherently except the one who is himself the highest good? One that I find fascinating is in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. Jesus says blithely, you've heard it said, but I say. Well, where have you heard it said? In the Torah. Well, the Torah for a first century Jew, that's the highest authority there is. Because the Torah was seen as the Word of God, quite rightly. Who's this Galilean prophet to say, well, you've heard it said there, but I say? Claiming authority even over the Torah. Who could do that except the one who is himself the author of the Torah? That's why we hear that language, we take it for granted. That's breathtaking business. Up and down the Gospels, you hear this affirmation. Also in Paul. Of course, the Pauline letters precede the Gospels. They're written somewhere in the decade of the 50s, probably, of the first century. What do you find over and again in Paul? Jesus Kyrios in his Greek. Jesus is the Lord. Jesus is the Lord. Well, that's code. Paul was Shaul, right? Saul, who studied at the feet of Gamaliel, the greatest rabbi of the time. He knew the Old Testament through and through. What's basic in the Old Testament is Adonai, Lord, is a term used exclusively of God. And so when Paul, who knew that tradition back and forth, it was in his bones and his blood, when Paul said, Jesus is Lord, he knew just what he was saying. And he knew how strange and radical it was. That this Jesus is God. That's the most important thing that we know about the Lord. And I push a little bit further. That's why Jesus compels a choice in the way that no other founder does. Muhammad, to his infinite credit, never claimed to be God. Muhammad said, I'm a messenger. I've received a message from God. Moses, to his infinite credit, never claimed to be divine. Moses had received the law from God and gave it to the people. The Buddha, to his infinite credit, never claimed to be divine. What he said was, I found a way. Then there's Jesus, who doesn't say, I found a way. He says, I am the way. How strange that is. He doesn't say, I found a truth. Let me tell you about it. I am the truth. He didn't say, hey, there's this new mode of life that I've discovered. Let me share it with you. I am the life. Those claims are the unique treasure of Christianity. And therefore, as I said, they compel a choice. Either, as Jesus himself said, either you're with me or you're against me. If Jesus is who he says he is, I must give my whole life to him. He's God. He's the highest good. If he's not who he says he is, he's a bad man. You can find that, by the way, in the apologetic tradition of Catholicism. Aut Deus, aut malus homo. That means either he's God or he's a bad man. And you got to decide. Either you gather with me or you scatter. Either you're with me or you're against me. And there is the gospel. The gospel is the good news about this Jesus, and it compels, on the part of those who hear it, a decision, a choice. I think that's the most important thing we know about Jesus.
G.K. Chesterton said, we'll kind of wrap up with this, said that Jesus Christ is either one of three things. He's either Lord, liar, or lunatic. Lord, liar, or lunatic. And we can go through the different progressions of that. But if he is who he says he is, it changes everything. So that big question of that God exists, we can feel comfortable with an intellectual understanding of that. Who is this God? Is it Jesus Christ? We're going to affirm yes, of course, and there's lots of reasons which we're not going to get into just right now. But that's a very important claim. If he is who he says he is, it changes everything.